Hello, everyone, and welcome to VIDA News Live. I am your host, Dom Garrett. Thank you so much for joining our show today. I am very excited to be able to have our two guests that we have today. We have Amelia Howard and Dr. Roberto Sussman. I am thrilled to be able to bring them in just a little bit for our conversation, talking about misinformation and misinformation around tobacco harm reduction. I think that it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful discussion. But before that, I want to give everybody just a little bit of an update. If you were paying attention to our broadcast last week or the couple of broadcasts we've had before that, you noticed that typically at the top of our show, I would talk about some of the different news that happened in the world of tobacco harm reduction, trying to fight back against misinformation, keep everybody up to date, but we are making a little bit of a shift. So what we are actually going to be doing moving forward, if you notice, we have these things called tobacco harm reduction updates. We actually just put one out last night talking about the FDA giving that new marketing language approval to IQOS and what that means for other manufacturers of tobacco harm reduction products. So what we are going to be doing is we're going to be turning these broadcasts into more of the topic-based conversations. Last week, we discussed regulation versus prohibition. And then moving forward, this is really what we're going to be talking about. So I want to, first off, let everybody know that if you have any questions for our panelists, either before the broadcast or during, you can make sure to comment. Our team is going to make sure that we can get to as many of those questions as possible. But then also, if you have any specific topics that you would like to see us cover, if there's anything that you think, any specific guests, anything like that, we really want VIDA News to be that home, that place where these conversations can happen, where we can be very open, very transparent, kind of the opposite of what you see in the public health space. But that's really what we want this to be. So please make sure to reach out to us however you would like. You can send an email to hello@vida.news. You can go to our website. You can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, all of that kind of stuff. We are very excited to be able to make this as interactive as possible. So please do not hesitate for that, especially on today's broadcast, which is what I am very excited to be able to talk about right now. We have two amazing guests that I'm going to be able to bring in here, talking about misinformation and harm reduction. The first guest that I would like to bring in right now is Amelia Howard. She is a PhD candidate in sociology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Waterloo. Amelia, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
All right, I think we're having just a little bit. I can hear you, yes. How are you doing today, Amelia? I'm
well, thank you. I'm kind of warm, but otherwise fine.
Good, wonderful, great to have you on. So Amelia, I wanted to start off. You are like I said, a PhD candidate in sociology. I know that you have talked a lot about nicotine vapor technology. How harm reduction and misinformation is spread. You've studied it, you've written about it, a couple of op-eds. I saw one from last fall in the Philly Inquirer. Can you just tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you got into this space in the first place?
Sure. So I was in a PhD program studying the sociology of technology, which is basically the study of, well, there's a lot of things, but I was interested in the social element of innovation. So how do human social relations basically help lead to the technologies we have, and particularly interested in user innovations. So vaping was a really interesting case study in that, because it began as essentially user innovation. I'm talking about vaping, not e-cigarettes per se, which were more, developed by, everyone knows the story of this by now, but I was really interested in the period right after the very first e-cigarettes came out, where a user community kind of gathered around them to make them better, and how they, communicated online and did stuff like that. And I had I've always been very positive towards harm reduction, and I would consider myself a harm reduction supporter. I was never actively involved in harm reduction advocacy, just because, you can't pick every cause. But I think about 2 years into this project, when you study vaping and you know about it, and you know its origins, and then you sort of hear things that don't fit with what you know about it, just from like being aware of what the technology is, who's making it, who's selling it, and then hearing this entirely different narrative about, big tobaccos, like big plots and all of this stuff. And that's when I started, and noticing sort of how people who were positive towards vaping in academia, public health people, especially it was Public Health England's experts, that I really started to notice like the way they were being framed. And I knew that that was just kind of incorrect. And it was around, I guess, like 2014, 15, been doing this for a while, where I started to sort of see that I couldn't really study this without also sort of engaging in the politics of it. Just because A, I vape, and B, it just didn't feel right. Like, if you know that, there's a lot of misinformation going around about this, and because I sort of knew more than the average person, I just didn't want to see this get sort of hijacked. Not that it hasn't, but that's sort of when I became more politically engaged. I could write op-eds, go to things like GFN or eSig Summit, and kind of get involved with the actual harm reduction community. And so that's sort of like my story. It started as a purely like academic kind of interest in this stuff, and then sort of broadened out to still academically interesting, looking at the controversy around it, but also, when I can, when it's appropriate, engaging in that myself.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So that actually leads me to a question. Seeing how we at VIDA, we also sort of straddle that line of, you have you have sort of the academic side, the studies, the science, and then you also have the side of, the real world, right? Like the people that are using these products, that have used them to be able to stop smoking, that, have attribute this as the thing that has helped them add years onto their life. From the academic side, I know that sometimes the world of tobacco can seem a little taboo. Do you, inside of the sociology department or inside of the academic side, what is the sentiment that people sort of look at, whether it's the actual products or just tobacco harm reduction in general? What do you sort of see people looking at that as?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. This is a complex question. I know personally, when I started out with this, I didn't really want anything to do with the public health side of things, just because it wasn't really my area, but also a lot of sociologists, I would say the majority of sociologists, and there's, sociologists of health might be different, but in general, you are supposed to maintain an analytic difference from what you're studying. Most sociologists would probably agree that it's not our job as sociologists to be studying something for the purpose of getting people not to do it. And so that's sort of what drives the research agenda in, say, tobacco control. It's in some ways conflicts with sociology, and even to an extent with harm reduction. I don't feel as a sociologist that it is my business to encourage people to smoke or not. Like, as a person, I would always recommend vaping just because I like it and I think it's good. But it's that, so like, you are constrained in terms of like when you look at how funding is doled out, or any of these things, there's not a lot of work to do for the kind of sociological questions about smoking that would be interesting. And there are definitely sociologists that do study that stuff, and they do a great job, but it's not a booming field, because basically most tobacco studies and science it's dominated by either the industry, people that are doing like kind of innovation stuff, or it's dominated by tobacco control. And so you're a bit of an odd person out in that sense. I know when I first started, I was the only sociologist studying vaping. I know other sociologists that did dabble in kind of the culture of tobacco or the culture of tobacco control and kind of left because it can be very stigmatizing if you're not willing to take a position. And I did just want to say too that one of the things that kind of empowered me to do it was being around vapors and really realizing sort of how much vapor expertise sort of mattered. And that was one thing where I felt that I could come in as an academic and you know, translate that, but also translate kind of what was normal and what wasn't in the academic side of things to vapors, because I think I saw a lot of people being really discouraged by science or scientists, and that really worried me.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you know, it's those problems that you have of, you know, being able to, I mean, sort of be in both worlds, and then also, you know, just the typical issues that you have when it comes to anything really in the tobacco space, it seems.
Yeah.
You know, with that, I am interested as well in your studies specifically around this. When it comes to the sociology perspective, have you, from thinking about other harm reduction, you know, other harm reduction fights in the past? Obviously, you know, harm reduction itself is not a new thing to tobacco. It's been around for a while. It is, you know, has worked in many other arenas. From a sociology perspective, have you seen any specific differences in how tobacco harm reduction is sort of viewed as opposed to other harm reduction methods? You know, is it are we on sort of the same path, just, you know, lagging behind? Can you speak to that at all?
So one of the things that so it's hard to say because I'm not like, in terms of like the history of harm reduction, what I know is I know that most harm reduction, when it starts out, is very controversial. So if you have something that looks like a double standard now, it, in some senses, like it might be in a different phase of whatever cycle it is, and things can cycle back too. So there's certainly like more vitriol towards tobacco harm reduction than other more accepted forms of harm reduction. I would say that, you know, the one thing that I find very unique about this space, and it's not harm reduction in particular, but just about the whole issue space, is that very, very tense, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, just the conflict between industry and tobacco control, and particularly big tobacco and tobacco control. And so this is unusual for a few reasons. Like, first of all, you know, big tobacco is not a small industry, and there's a ton of money flying around there, and they have serious interest in very particular products. On the tobacco control side, especially American tobacco control, I have never encountered, and I'm sure they are, but like the money that goes into American tobacco control is really something else as well. So these are these two massive systems with very particular, not disinterested positions that are studying this. And that's where I would say that this is a bit different than, you know, panics around or like opposition to like other drug things. Although at the time, you know, there's always those interests at play. I would say that in terms of the panic, it's very similar. Very. For
sure. Yeah, we definitely see that. I mean, we see it almost every day if you're paying attention. And I'm also really excited now to be able to welcome in our second guest, Dr. Roberto Sussman. He is a researcher at the Institute of Nuclear Sciences at the National Autonomous University in Mexico. He is also the founder of Provapio Mexico, a member of the International Network of Nicotine Consumer Organizations, works closely with Tomas, who we've had on the show a couple of times. Roberto, I'm very excited to welcome you onto the program. Thank you so much for joining.
To be here. Hi, Amelia. Long time.
Hi, Roberto.
Yeah, it's nice to be with you, and it's a fantastic company. And yeah, here, you know, quarantine, pandemics. I've been working at home, and yes, thank you very much, and hi.
Wonderful. Well, Roberto, you know, I gave a little bit of an introduction there. You know, I personally am very excited to be able to have you on the program. I was thinking earlier today, I was like, this is probably the first time that I've had the opportunity to speak directly with an astrophysicist, especially one that, you know, now is working.
Let's roll.
Yeah. So Roberto, if just like I asked Amelia, you know, it's interesting to hear how you. I would love to hear how you got into. You obviously do a lot of work in research and in the science field, but if you could just tell our audience a little bit of how you got into the tobacco harm reduction space and you know, the story of Provapio, Mexico.
Yeah, well, I'm have this combination of being a scientist and being also a consumer, right? So I got in because I'm a consumer, and I'm an ex-smoker. I still smoke a cigar occasionally, like once every few days. I smoke a cigar, but I got in because I started seeing a lot of institutional bullying about smoking, and I started vaping not because I wanted to quit smoking, but because I liked it. I really enjoyed it. And so it started bothering me why, if vaping was considerably safer than smoking, why it was still attacked. And I started applying science in this respect, because I'm a physicist, and though I'm not my field is cosmology and astrophysics, but I have training in fluid dynamics, in thermodynamics, and so on. And I started looking at the science of it, and I was amazed to discover a lot of low quality work, and a lot of, I don't know if I can be diplomatic, but or not, but lies, simply lies. When you say 2 + 2 is 5, it is a lie. It is simply wrong. There is no diplomatic way to say, no, well, it is misinformation or whatever. No. I found lots of very misleading and false and fraudulent research. And then it came the other bit of my identity, which is being a scientist. I'm a scientist, and I don't like when there is a systematic institutional effort to mop the floor with science. And so these two combinations got me moving in a very intentional way. Perhaps if I had been a scientist but not a consumer, or if I had been a consumer and not a scientist, things would have gone the other way. Because there are many consumers that tell us, look, you are right, but I don't have time to be involved. And there are many fellow scientists that I work with. They tell me, well, you are right, but then they don't have this emotion. They sometimes even say, well, you are so emotional about it because you are a smoker or you're a vapor. But I'm not a vapor. I don't vape, I don't smoke. And I'm not willing to buy your idea that there is a whole established science of tobacco science that is lying, or that is not telling the truth, the complete truth. Because the one colleague told me in particular, you are telling me, this was a conversation in Warsaw with a very bright theoretical physicist in Warsaw. When I explained to him all our conversation, he said, look, there are some people who take care of the water system in Poland, in Warsaw. They are chemical engineers. I don't know them, but I trust them. You're telling me that I shouldn't trust them. That's a hard sell. And then I explained to him issues about disruptive technology and so on. So he was more neutral about that, but he was not willing to get involved. And then I got in touch with people in Mexico who came from other routes, lawyers, architects, and so on. And we noticed that in Mexico we had lots of vaping associations, but we did not have something like Provapeo. Provapeo is not connected to any vendor, to any industry, not because we dislike them. We also hate these anti-industry crusades and so on. We think industry is it's a player that has to be not to the table, but sit on the table, right? So we got together, and that's how Provapeo Mexico came about. And it is surprising how we are such a small thing. We're a little piece of a pin, right? We're a very tiny thing. We're a few guys. We work part-time. We don't even have a bank account. And now we are already making inroads in our Congress. We already have convinced several legislators to back our case. And we have a good following in the social networks. We've been also in mainstream TV and in mainstream newspapers and so on. We're accused of being an arm of big tobacco, because INCO has received grants, and so, but we don't even have a bank account. Can you believe that?
Yeah,
it's
hard to receive payments, and if you don't even have a bank account. So
we don't even have a bank account. See, when we finance our activities from our own purse, because we are middle class people, we're professionals, and we put some of our money in that, right?
Yeah,
and
it's really it's interesting too, because you mentioned something that you have a very wide range of people that are a part of Provapeo Mexico, and that I would argue that is the case across a lot of different consumer advocates and advocates for harm reduction. You don't necessarily need to have a background in it or have studied it to be able to understand and look at science and see that it is saying a certain thing, that this works to change the habits and to help people be healthier down the line. And so, Roberto, you said something really interesting where you got personally upset that you saw that these big organizations were, as you say, wiping the floor with science. Can you speak a little bit to, it could be in Mexico, it could also be, a little bit larger. I know that both of you have actually talked a bit about the CDC in ways that this has happened, especially around the lung injury last year. What are some ways that you have seen that happen? Roberto, and then Amelia, I would love to get your thoughts on that as well. What are some ways you've seen that happen, like very specific instances of ways that science has not necessarily been given the respect that it deserves?
Yes. I've spoken about it extensively. For example, there are two ways in which science is being misrepresented. There is one way in which you say 2 + 2 is 5. This type of very sloppy technical errors. It's using the wrong way, simply carrying on an experiment under conditions that are not appropriate, etc. This is one way. That's easy to identify. Then there is another way that is very subtle. There are different degrees of subtlety, but it's harder to pin. It's harder to find out, especially for non-specialists. And it is exaggerating or distorting your own results, right? And this is very, very widespread. And it is not easy to explain to people how an academic from a reputable university is saying that that vaping is causing X, Y, and Z. And this is what the press review will say, because if you are a journalist and you are not trained in science, what do you see of the paper? You see the title, maybe the abstract, and the conclusions, and a few words. You just need a paragraph, right? And so these people, they advertise huge risks, horrible results, shocking. But when you see the paper, you see that that's not what they found, right? But you have to see the paper, right? You have. This is like buying a bottle. See here, it's a bottle. See the liquor is okay, but you put horrible things outside, the bottle will burn your hands and will have horrible images. And this is what you show people. You show this bottle. But what is inside of the bottle does not justify the message. You can do it the other way as well, right? You can have horrible things inside. So this is very difficult to, and this is very common practice. Very common, and especially in some subjects more than in other. And in the case of EVALI, that was an everyday situation, because in the case of EVALI, if you know physics and chemistry, some even high school, or well, let's say not high school, but undergraduate physics and chemistry, you can understand that nicotine could not have caused this, right? Because the chemistry of the stuff that you are vaping is completely different, right? One is soluble in water. It's based on alcohols, and the other one is based on liquids, right? So
exactly.
There are different things. It's like if you are burning glass, or you are burning paper, or you are burning wood. They're different. Yeah, you are burning them. Here, the process is making an aerosol out of a liquid, right? But it depends on what liquid you have, right?
True. Now, Amelia, I wanted to ask you as well, because I know that I think your pinned tweet actually talks about this and what, how the CDC actually, had this message out. And, we've done our best at trying to fight this. Even the term EVALI itself, putting e-cigarette right at the very beginning is incredibly misleading. Can you sort of speak to that from like a sociology perspective, how that message and what the CDC has done has caused more harm than, what they have tried to intend to stop?
Sure. Yeah, when the so-called EVALI outbreak first started happening, I mean, that was a really interesting moment for me, and also really scary, just because at the time, nobody knew what was actually happening. And when I first saw these news stories that were coming from these pediatric hospitals in America, mostly, and all they would say is that, the kid had used an e-cigarette and then they were sick. And at first I didn't believe that it was necessarily related to vaping. I thought it was maybe this, false association sort of thing. But as these cases kept piling up, it became clear that they were vaping something. But again, there was really no mechanism for nicotine e-cigarettes to have caused that. And that was pretty clear from the beginning. Plus, the whole thing with people have vaped for how long, and this has never happened before, and all of a sudden it's happening. And it's quite obviously there's a contaminant or there's an ingredient. And then, so when it became clear that it was these ingredients in THC oil vapes, which the cannabis reporting community was really great on that. And I learned so much about this other side of vaping that I never really knew about. That, right, well, really at first, the CDC shouldn't have said anything about e-cigarettes until they had kind of figured out what this was, or at least should have been more clear on it. But then, for them to keep using that language, I mean, I always do struggle sometimes in this space. Well, it's kind of an ongoing question for me whenever I encounter a new situation is whether, what's going on here? So the CDC is saying e-cigarette related lung disease or whatever they're saying. Are they saying that because they don't know, or are they saying that because they're being dishonest? And this was one of those situations where it was a little bit muddier between incompetence and dishonesty at first, even though I do think there was a great deal of dishonesty, and this was obviously used for political reasons. I think that part of the problem with the CDC was because these doctors at these hospitals were saying the kids were vaping and they're vaping users, they don't know what they're vaping or they weren't asking. And I'm not sure if this is exactly what happened, but it seemed like CDC Tobacco was put on the case right away. CDC Tobacco doesn't know anything about this other line of products, for one, and
True.
they're pretty up in the air about what they know about nicotine vaping. And so I think that that was like the first wrong decision, and that got kind of pulled into this whole fight on flavors and on ultrafine particles and this and that. It was almost like their dream come true, or like this sort of, they wanted it to sort of be like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And at a certain point, when you've started on that page, it's hard to go back from without really making yourself look like incompetent or look like
True.
mindful. And I think that they, to a certain extent, dug in their heels. Like, they finally acknowledged what the cause was, but it took them how long? I mean, we were all comparing notes, people that had been talking about this for some time, on when we started talking about this versus when the CDC said it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was very scary, and it's still very scary because people still don't know.
Exactly. And, you know, that language is continuing to be used. You know, it was, I think just 2 broadcasts ago, you know, we talked about how the FDA had room for open comment, and they were asking people specifically about, you know, like e-cigarette related lung injury and what they can be able to do about it. And, you know, it might seem, you know, inconsequential to some people, but that perception really does matter, because it changes, you know, it stops people from, you know, there was a study out of the UK, you know, Public Health England did it, that showed that half of those people that smoke inside of that country wrongly believe that, you know, these products, these tobacco harm reduction products, are just as dangerous as cigarettes. And we know that that's, you know, they're 95% less harmful. That is, you know, and that is, you know, speaking to what Roberto said, I mean, that is science, and that's science that is just sort of, you know, it's tossed off to the side as not being something that's worth talking about. And it is very dangerous. One thing that I do want to say right now is we do have a couple of questions that are coming in. We will make sure to be able to get to those. Please, if you're watching this and you have any questions for Amelia or Roberto, fire them off. We will definitely get to your comments for sure. One question I did want to ask specifically to Roberto, I know that you talked about this a little bit in your presentation at the Global Forum on Nicotine this year, and you started off talking about how the CDC got EVALI so wrong, and how, you know, we've had this conversation on the program before, that erosion of public trust in, you know, this organization, that while it is based in the United States, it obviously has a long reach, and there's many countries, both, you know, Amelia up in Canada, Roberto down in Mexico, it reaches far and wide, and what they say matters more than just inside the boundary of the United States. And we see that now with COVID, and how, you know, we see an erosion of public trust in public health and what they say that you should be able to do. And it's a pandemic now, and now we have like a lot of other things, especially impacting those that want access to these products. So Roberto, can you sort of talk a little bit about how you've seen that misinformation sort of play out in 2 different scenarios, but have that, you know, sort of the same effect in both areas?
Yeah, in the case of EVALI, I hate to call it EVALI. I would rather call it some other. It's like I would rather.
We need a new word for it. That's for sure.
Yes. Okay. In case of, but in that search of pulmonary intoxications, there were dead people. No, of course they inhaled something that was vaporized, that didn't come from nicotine, but you had dead people, you had hospitalized people, right? In EVALI, in the case of EVALI, in the case of COVID, there are no where are the sick vapors? I'm sure that vapors have caught the virus because many healthy people, even athletes or media people or even presidents, I think the president of Brazil just was infected, Boris Johnson got it. So there is no reason why a vapor would not get the virus. But getting the virus is very different from being in a serious condition, right? To require hospitalization. Your symptoms are sufficiently serious to be taken to the hospital, right?
Yeah.
So at this level of entrance to COVID-19, there are no vapors. Where are the vapors? Where are they? Like I'm putting myself on the shoes of people like the CDC who were able to generate a false panic on nicotine vaping, right? Based on a black market issue, on a very localized phenomenon that did not spread outside of the US, right? But they were able to do this setup, to do this hat trick, because what they did was a hat trick. They were able to do that because they had John Doe and Jane Doe who were in the hospital. They showed you their lungs, and these people were using vaporized stuff. So it was easy to do the hat trick. But now in the case of COVID, where are the hospitalized vapors? Like I'm putting myself on their shoes. They're desperately looking for victims of vaping, right?
Yes.
But they have not found them. They have not found them. That's a problem.
Yeah, and Roberto, I wanted to ask you specifically because I know that you did some work. You know, we've heard here in the United States and around the world, you know, how those that use these products, you know, they were trying to get people to stop using any sort of, you know, alternative nicotine products because they said that it could cause, you know, it could lead to more severe cases of COVID. Now, I know that can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you did to fight against that misinformation? You created a guide for consumers of these products, correct?
Yes, exactly. Because what we noticed is a colleague of mine, Carmen Skrig, who is a microbiologist. In fact, she specializes in virology. We noticed that most of the consumers will never read a scientific article. They get information from the media or from TV or whatever. And so what we wanted was to convey to them scientific information in a very precise, condensed way, but at the same time trying to be as rigorous as possible and to spread it through social networks. Because the typical consumer will never read Journal of Nicotine and Tobacco Research or the British Medical Journal or New England Journal of Medicine. They will never read that. But we sent through social networks this document, which was a very concise 4-page document that covered everything and gave advice to vapors. Like, for example, if we're in an environment where vaping is being under attack, then don't blow up big clouds. Use a small, low-power device. We also explain that people should not be worried that the aerosol that we exhale, the vapor that we exhale, is particularly noxious or adverse, or that it's a very efficient agent to transmit the virus. It is not. It is not.
Yeah, that's one thing that's interesting. Can you talk a little bit? I believe in your GFN presentation, you said that, you know, it's actually travels, you know, not even as far as if you were just exhaling, correct?
No, it is as an airflow. See, what happens, the key scientific issue is that you see the cloud, right? But the cloud, actually, it's a very, very small part of the weight. When you exhale, you blow up about half a liter of fluid. That fluid is almost exclusively air. the cloud will make 1 part in a million of the weight of that cloud. So the dynamics of this cloud is basically air. And the speed in which it comes out of your mouth is the same speed as when you blow, when you breathe with your mouth. So in terms of, as a vector of contagion, it is the same as breathing with your mouth. It's not like sneezing. Sneezing or coughing, those are very efficient ways to spread these droplets that contain the virus, right? Because the speed where when you sneeze, it comes out of your mouth at 20 meters per second, right? When you cough, it's about 10 meters per second. But if you breathe with the mouth, it's between 1 and 2 meters per second. So it is basically the same type of spreading vector as breathing, with one difference. You are breathing all the time, but you are vaping maybe only 100 or 150 times per day. So as a vector to spread the disease is very inefficient. It is like breathing with the mouth. Now, because we're very visible creatures,
yes,
we tend to think that the cloud, there are kilograms or pounds of stuff in the air, but actually it is a big cloud will be maybe 1 in 10,000 parts of a gram, while the air will be 1 gram, right? So
yes,
depends on how much you exhale, of course. But
exactly.
as a vector to transmit COVID, it's insignificant. It's you transmit much more by breathing, because you do it all the time, than by vaping, right?
It's interesting.
And
I never thought that I would know this much about particles or droplets. You know, I feel like we're all getting a master class in things like that. It's very, very interesting. I do want to get to a couple of our audience questions. I know I want to be mindful of your time and the audience's time. Amelia, I had one specifically for you, and the question was, what is the sociological view of the stigmatization of those who smoke, also those that use vapor products, as subhuman addicts? I know we've talked about stigmatization a bit on this program before. Can you speak to that from a sociological perspective?
Sure, yeah. So there would be multiple sociological views on this. I think that the one that I find very compelling is you know, the association of smoking with class. And so, you know, literally with the fact that smoking is concentrated among poor people, or not even just class, like just in terms of groups that are already stigmatized, so people with mental illness, poor people, and it's not part of these sort of middle class norms anymore. And I mean, there's lots of things that are like that. Like you'll have things that are part of the, like, quote unquote dominant class, the mainstream, the sort of aspirational view of like what a normal happy person might look like in a certain society. And this is in the West. Whereas smoking, you know, when they went through tobacco control initiatives, they were very successful in stigmatizing smoking for a particular group of people, which was you know, white middle class folk, and very unsuccessful in you know, getting the working class to stop smoking. So because in some ways, you know, these people are outside of their audience anyway. And so, I mean, I think that to me is sort of one of the big issues. Basically, you know, sociologists see the world, well, certain kinds of sociologists see the world in terms of types of conflict, as, and sort of like a competition between class is a big one. And you can use smoking to basically, you know, control the poor, to set yourself above people and stuff like this. But it also, I think in some ways, because these are already stigmatized groups, it makes it hard to sort of combat it on that level. So that's one of many sort of things. Now, I also think that most sociologists would fundamentally oppose the idea of like an academic science being oriented towards stigmatizing people like as a practical goal, which is what I see in a lot of tobacco control work. And now, to be fair to tobacco control, there's lots of debate within that field about the ethics of using stigma or perpetuating stigma. But
it's interesting. We talked about that with Dr. David Abrams of you know, the NYU School of Public Health. Specifically, you know, he also is a behavioral psychologist and has sat down with people, and that idea of stigma, if used, I mean, you know, shame itself is not necessarily just a net negative thing. There is something that can be used if you want to use that to change, but the weaponization of that can be very, very dangerous. And, you know, there's studies showing that it has the adverse effect and can actually drive people towards the behavior that they and you might want them to be able to make. Roberto, there was one quick question for you. Is secondhand nicotine, is it a thing or is it a problem? Is secondhand nicotine, can you speak to that from any sort of a scientific perspective?
Well, you mean secondhand vapor, or you mean the nicotine that is that we exhale when we vape? When we vape, is it the nicotine that we exhale? Actually, when you vape, your body absorbs like between 94 and 97% of the nicotine. So what comes out from your mouth, it's minimal. Like there's an experiment carried on by Spanish chemists and physicists, that if you are located at about 30 centimeters distance it was 30 centimeters distance from the plume, from the jet that comes out of vaping, you get 50 nanograms of nicotine. This is 50 times 1 part in a billion of a gram of nicotine, right?
Wow.
So it's really minute. It is really well below any effect, any biology that it can cause. And then I also would like to emphasize that in the case of environmental emissions, it's very different from smoking, because when you are smoking, like 80% of what is released to the atmosphere comes from the burning point, the burning tip of the cigarette, right? The smoldering burning tip of the cigarette. This is what releases 80% of the emissions. In the case of vaping, because there is no burning tip of anything, there is no combustion, all the pollutants that might come out from your mouth, but your body absorbs 90% of what comes in. And also, the vapor that we exhale is composed of a very volatile component, the ethylene glycol, and it evaporates very fast. And the droplets are the so-called particles that people make a lot of fuss about. That they are liquid droplets that evaporate very fast and disperse very fast. We can all see it. You don't have to be a scientist to notice that if you vape in a room for 5 minutes, there is no trace of it, right? Because that's the physics of the thing, right? And nicotine is the part of nicotine that is there is barely detectable. It's really barely detectable. In the case of the cigarette, that's different, because a lot of the nicotine is released by the burning tip of the cigarette. So there is about 50 to 100 times more nicotine from secondhand smoke than from environmental vapor, right? But many articles found this. What I'm telling you, I'm not inventing it. It's in many articles, but the authors, how do they report it? They say, oh, nicotine, be careful. Pregnant women, babies, they're going be careful. Can be very dangerous, right? And if you are a non-scientist, a lay person, this is what you get. You don't get the 50 nanograms. You don't get the 90%. You don't get the volatiles, the evaporation. You don't get the 5 minutes. No, you get it's dangerous. If your wife is pregnant, don't bring her next to the vapor, right? This is what people, and this is the misinformation, right? I want to stress that this misinformation, that's the way it works. That's the way it works. See?
Yes, and that's, I mean, that is, you know, that's why we talk so much on this program about how that type of language matters. And, you know, we discussed a little bit in, you know, the update that we did about the FDA, you know, with the IQOS product. It's interesting that, you know, while they didn't say that it could reduce the health risks of, of the smoking combustible tobacco, they did say, however, that it does reduce the exposure to potentially harmful chemicals. And, you know, I do hope that this is something that even that becomes more understood knowledge, that these products, you know, even if you're just talking about somebody else, not necessarily yourself, but somebody else, that it does not have the same, you know, ill effects. And so one thing, you know, as we wrap up the program here, I do want to ask both of you this question. You know, obviously you are both you know, users of these products, you know, but a lot of people that watch our broadcasts and that see this, they might not have ever used combustible tobacco, or they do not use these alternative nicotine products. For those people, those that do have friends and family members that do, what would your, you know, Amelia, I'll start with you. What would your message to those people be if they're being bombarded with all of this misinformation? They see it in the media, they see it through the government. How can they really fight back against that to be able to not only know the correct things, but also to be able to share that with their friends and family who might not?
Okay, that's a big question. I mean,
it's a big question, but
okay, so at the end of the day, like, Roberto's touched on this quite a few times, but you know, one of the things here is this is not, it's not rocket science. It's not astrophysics. It's, you know, there's such a thing as consensual science and, you know, a controversial new thing. And the way this is talked about in the media is on the controversial new thing side. But, you know, the science of smoking and smoking risks is very, very consensual. We know there's a lot we don't know about smoke. We do know the mechanisms by which smoking causes harm. We know quite a bit about nicotine. And so, I mean, on that level alone, if you have a family member who is smoking, you know, and give them something else, because if they try it, and they might be like Roberto, and I have a similar story where you actually don't try it because you're trying to quit smoking, and you quit because you like it. And so this is that sort of alternative. And so I would just be, I think one of the things is people need to be aware that this is a situation of panic, and that media panics are very real, and that you need to be very, very skeptical about what you hear on the news, and just to sort of figure out, like, there's just some basic things, like smoke is what kills you in a cigarette, and, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And just be aware that right now there, or at least a little bit before COVID, there is a push to kind of demonize this because there's a lot of interest groups involved. And I think people need to be really sort of skeptical about claims from any interested party, including tobacco companies, including vapor companies for that matter. But the bottom line is, like, we know that there's no mechanism by which this can be anywhere near as harmful as smoking. And for that reason alone, it's worth trying. And I mean, the other thing too is, I think a lot of people just don't think they can quit, or they want to do it right. And that gets back to the idea of stigma. So taking up another tobacco product that's safer, or a harm reduction product like vaping that doesn't have tobacco in it, you kind of feel like you're cheating yourself, or you're cheating the system or whatever. And I would just sort of say that's BS, and it's okay to use nicotine, and you use it for reasons like either you're addicted or you like it or this or that, you might as well move to something safer if you can like that. So I would just be treating everything very skeptically right now.
Thank you. That wonderful. Roberto, what would you say to those that might be on the outside looking in?
Yeah, well, I would also, not wishing to repeat what Amelia said, that I completely agree. But just to add on top of that, that you should also tell people that it's enjoyable, right?
Yes.
This mimics my own experience. Like I smoke my cigars. I don't come from the world of cigarettes. I come from the world of cigars and pipes, right? I enjoy them. However, they were already causing serious problems in my throat because I used to smoke 4, 5 cigars a day. It's an expensive habit also, right? And then I tried one of these. In fact, the first one I tried was like a cigar-like. I still have it. I try. It doesn't work anymore, but it's a souvenir. And the first one I didn't like, but then I tried the second generation, and I enjoyed it. I liked it. I liked the taste of grape, and so I would emphasize that. I would tell people that this is not only much healthier because of the lack of combustion. There is no combustion. There's less stuff that is entering. All diseases have a chemical basis, right? It's very similar. The analogy that I tell people is that suppose you want to build a building, so you need building material. If you are going to build a huge building, you need lots of stones and concrete and so on. But if you have only a little bit of sand, how much as you twist it around, you're not going to build a big building. And the same with disease. The chemistry around is too simple to generate a huge disease thing, right? But that's a secondary thing. I emphasize the issue of pleasure. And I also tell people you're not going to smell. People will enjoy it. And you are also not going to cause any problem to delicate people. Breathing, like secondhand smoke, can be problematic to sensitive people. And I would emphasize that. And I would also say, and this is very important because there is this issue of authority, right? If Roberto Sussman says, blah, 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 it's taken this way. But if the Royal College of Physicians says the same thing as Roberto Sussman, then for many people that's more credible. We need an institutional backing on this. So one of my main arguments to many people is, don't believe me, but this is what the Royal College of Physicians is saying. In fact, more than Public Health England, the Royal College of Physicians is a more solid institution. And that's the institution that in the 1960s also raised the alarm about smoking, right? It's the same institution. So I would tell them this. I would use this institutional issue, tell them about that. And then I also say something. All the information that you get is from the CDC and the US. And the information I'm telling you comes from the United Kingdom. Which country has a better health system? That's it. Which country has a better health system? The US, where health is business, and where you have this problem with Obamacare, where you have 50,000 people with opioid problems, and the country that had a prohibition of alcohol and the health system is a disaster. And this is the information. On the other hand, I'm giving you information from a country that has one of the best systems of public health in the world. Not perfect, but one of the best. So, and one of their best institutions is recognizing that, because a lot of people are not aware that on the other side of the Atlantic, in that island, things are different. And not only in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Italy,
yes,
there are some odd cases. There are some basket cases, right? Finland, for example, but in general, I try to tell people there is an institution, scientific institution, very solid, and one government that has a very good health system that supports that. So don't believe me, but look at this. Look at who's taking.
Wonderful. All right, everybody, don't believe Roberto. Where Roberto got his information. I believe that. You can trust them. So Amelia, Roberto, thank you so much for joining the program today. I look forward to continuing the conversation. If you're watching this, I know that both of them they're active on Twitter. If we didn't get to your question, please just ping them, and I'm sure that they will take the time to respond to that. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Bye. Bye.
All right, that is our program for today. Thank you so much for joining. A quick programming update. We will not have any live broadcasts for the next 2 weeks. We are actually working on finalizing some things behind the scenes, potentially some new sets. However, we will still be active on social media. We have more reports. You can also find those at VIDA.news, VIDA.news for our website, also VIDA.news, as you can see down below me on all of our social profiles. Please make sure to, like I said at the beginning of the program, if you have any topics you would like to see covered, any specific guests, go ahead and tag them, tag us. We want to be able to have that conversation. It doesn't stop with this broadcast. And I look forward to seeing you in the next couple of weeks.